hardware. You've also got James's post on Boiling Frogs Post, a brief history of Israeli spying in the U.S. I also enjoyed the audio of James Corbett interviews Anton Chaikin on eugenics and the euthanasia agenda. Corbett Report Radio number 109, The New World Order Does Not Control Everything. There's also audio from MediaMonarchy episode number 254, Shipbuilding. And from the SchoolSucks podcast episode number 135, The American Way Expanded, part 2 of 3, which I'll be including in its entirety later on in this episode. Last but not least, there's MeriaHeller's interview, likewise, with Gilad Atzmon on his book, The Wandering Who? Now, if you're not already receiving the Media Mail, the weekly update, simply check the notes for this episode and click the invitation link to get connected through the Tragedy and Hope online community. Today's episode started out with some samples from chapters 28 and 30 of a book series titled The Story of Civilization by Will Durant, and it's from the early 20th century, and it's an audio version of the encyclopedic work of the same name, weighing in at just over 17.8 days, or 424.2 hours, or approximately 26,000 minutes. During the Ultimate History Lesson, A Weekend with John Taylor Gatto, you can hear John at one point describing the studies of Will and Ariel Durant. And while I found Durant's series on the story of philosophy to be a highly useful tool in such focused studies, over the past several weeks, I've developed a true appreciation for the story of civilization, not only because of the poetic prose through which Durant paints pictures of the past, but because of the value conveyed by undertaking a journey such as that which I'm describing. In the first few hours, I had already heard history repeating through various early civilizations of humankind, and I feel that listening to it gives me a clearer and richer context from which to draw conclusions in my daily life. And I highly recommend it to you if you're looking for a healthy way to reprioritize your habits, to fortify your mind, and it's available on torrents, that's how I found it, and other web-friendly locations. Perhaps finding it is just the first step in your journey. In listening to the tracks while working on the construction of the set and studio for our new video series, History, So It Doesn't Repeat, I found myself being productive in organizational and assembly activities while simultaneously being made privy to some of the most fascinating history I've ever had the pleasure to witness, all the while creating pictures of the concepts I was receiving from the perception of Durant's words. I found great pleasure in learning about the history of humankind, and I drew serenity from working hard and learning along the way. It was like being double productive. Now, during that time of double productivity, I heard a section of one of the earlier volumes, and the track number of which escapes me, so I'm just going to read to you what I found when I looked up the words used by Durant before he read the same passage, which is titled, The Sermon on Abuse. Quote, "The Blessed One observes the ways of society and noticed how much misery came from malignity. And the Buddha said, quote, 'If a man foolishly does me wrong, I will return to him the protection of my ungrudging love. The more evil comes from him, the more good shall come from me. The fragrance of goodness always comes to me, and the harmful air of evil goes to him.'" End quote. Continuing on with this passage from the Story of Civilization, "A foolish man, learning that the Buddha observed the principle of great love, which commends the return of good for evil, came and abused him. The Buddha was silent, pitying his folly. When the man had finished his abuse, the Buddha asked him, saying, 'Son, if a man declined to accept a present made to him, to whom would it belong?' And he answered, 'In that case, it would belong to the man who offered it.' 'My son,' said the Buddha, 'thou hast railed at me, but I decline to accept thy abuse, and request thee to keep it thyself. Will it not be a source of misery to thee? As the echo belongs to the sound and the shadow to the substance, so misery will overtake the evildoer without fail.'" The abuser made no reply, and the Buddha continued. A wicked man who reproaches a virtuous one is like one who looks up and spits at heaven. The spittle soils not the heaven, but comes back and defiles his own person. The slanderer is like one who flings dust at another. When the wind is contrary, the dust does but return on him who threw it. The virtuous man cannot be hurt, and the misery that the other would inflict comes back on himself. The abuser went away ashamed, but he came again and took refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. End quote. I will continue to take notes and weave in samples from The Story of Civilization as I discover them and find ways to juxtapose them to the topic of each episode. So, if you're not already ready to embark on the journey, you'll have several more opportunities to study history, so it doesn't repeat. The remainder of this episode features samples from James Corbett's interview with John Rappaport discussing the importance and function of logic and reason, as well as the entirety of Brett Veinott's fantastic episode 135, which is part 2. I also recommend part 1, but we can't include everything here, of his series on the American Way, which started as a video, but he wanted to expand upon it because it drew a lot of interest. The second episode is titled Pyromania. The first was titled The Gasoline-Soaked House. And what Brett's doing is using some metaphors here to abstract some very complex ideas and return them to you in a summarized form with their essence intact. It's no easy feat, and that's why I wanted you to take a listen, and I think it demonstrates the historical legacy of irrationality and its evolution into our present-day philosophic corruption of reality, and it gives us clues on how to snuff out these illusions before they can do us any more harm. And speaking of those who would always look for a more efficient way of doing us harm, I've included the infamous lecture by Aldous Huxley, The Ultimate Revolution, given in 1961 at UC Berkeley on the topic of how to brainwash and control the minds of the masses, that's you and me, by the use of technocracy and cybernetics, to remove free will, liberty, and freedom from humanity forever. Now, by the time you get to this part at the end of the episode, you'll be well prepared and fortified to recognize the multitudinal fallacies stacked in the architecture of tyranny described by Huxley, which is the use of sophism to make irrationality seem rational. This entire episode is woven together to give you a sense of intellectual self-defense, which is practical, and to bolster your knowledge before engaging in action. It's one of the wisest things we can do daily. Last but not least, I'd like to read a letter written by Aldous Huxley to George Orwell in response to Orwell sending Huxley his new book, 1984. Now, it's worth mentioning that Aldous Huxley briefly taught French to a student named Eric Blair back in 1917 at the elite institution known as Eton. That being said, given the fact that Eric Blair later wrote under the pseudonym of George Orwell, it is evident that this was not the first time Huxley and Orwell had communicated. The contents of the letter reads as follows. Wrightwood, California, 21st of October, 1949. Dear Mr. Orwell, it was very kind of you to tell your publishers to send me a copy of your book. It has arrived as I was in the midst of a piece of work that required much reading and consulting of references, and since poor sight makes it necessary for me to ration my reading, I had to wait a long time before being able to embark on 1984. Agreeing with all the critics who have written of it, I need not tell you yet once more how fine and how profoundly important the book is. May I speak instead of the thing with which the book deals? The ultimate revolution? The first hints of a philosophy of the ultimate revolution, the revolution which lies beyond politics and economics, and which aims at total subversion of the individual's psychology and physiology, are to be found in the Marquis de Sade, who regarded himself as a continuator, the consummator of Robespierre and Babeuf. The philosophy of the ruling minority in 1984 is a sadism which has been carried to its logical conclusion by going beyond sex and denying it. Whether in actual fact the policy of the boot on the face can go on indefinitely seems doubtful. My own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and satisfying its lust for power, and these ways will resemble those which I described in Brave New World. I have had on occasion recently to look into the history of animal magnetism and hypnotism, and have been greatly struck by the way in which, for 150 years, the world has refused to take the serious cognizance of the discoveries of Mesmer, Braid, and Esdale, and the rest. Partly because of the prevailing materialism and partly because of prevailing respectability, 19th century philosophers and men of science were not willing to investigate the odder facts of psychology for practical men, such as politicians, soldiers, and policemen, to apply in the field of government. Thanks to the voluntary ignorance of our fathers, the advent of the ultimate revolution was delayed for 5 or 6 generations. Another lucky accident was Freud's inability to hypnotize successfully, his consequent disparagement of hypnotism. This delayed the general application of hypnotism to psychiatry for at least 40 years. But now psychoanalysis is being combined with hypnosis, and hypnosis has been made easy and indefinitely extensible through the use of barbiturates, which induce a hypnoid and suggestible state in even the most recalcitrant subjects. Within the next generation, I believe that the world's rulers will discover that infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. In other words, I feel that the nightmare of 1984 is destined to modulate into the nightmare of a world having more resemblance to that which I described in Brave New World. The change will be brought about as a result of the felt need for increased efficiency. Meanwhile, of course, there may be a large-scale biological or atomic war, in which case we shall have nightmares of other scarcely imaginable kinds. Thank you once again for the book. Yours sincerely, Aldous Huxley. Now, this will all make more sense after you've listened to this episode in its entirety, because there's a bit of learning to do before we can experience true cognitive liberty. And that is why this is episode 55. Only wisdom is freedom. Why tyranny needs your ignorance to exist. Thank you for your support, and thank you for tuning in and not dropping out.
Welcome back to Corbett Report Radio, friends, here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and tonight we're talking to John Rappaport of NoMoreFakeNews.com, and we're talking about some of the contents of his new CD, The Matrix Revealed, Volume 1, available at NoMoreFakeNews.com. And I want to start by getting into one of the, I think the meat and potatoes, really the underlying foundational education for much of what else is built upon it, which is the logic course that is included in this CD, which includes an 18-part course and accompanying MP3 audio files, quite a lot of material to go through. So, John, let's just start talking about logic and why it is a bedrock for understanding so much of what's happening in this world.
Okay. A very brief intro. One of the people that I interview extensively in The Matrix Revealed is Jack True, who is a late friend and colleague of mine, the most, by far, innovative hypnotherapist I've ever met. And his attack on the Matrix, you might say, in working with patients was to devise ways to really scope out the psychological aspects of how, on deep levels, people actually plug into the Matrix. how they get themselves trapped in it and to liberate them from it. And Jack has a great deal to say about that in many interviews that I do with him in the Matrix